Montreal is widely considered the most haunted city in all of Canada, and there's a reason for that. Layers upon layers upon layers of history, of course.
Today's story, however, is a little different from your normal, everyday haunting. The city is generally considered to be a landmark for UFO sightings and paranormal activity.
There are more sightings of UFOs over Quebec than in any other Canadian province.
I want you to go back to the time of your vacation in Montreal.
It was approximately 112 miles from Montreal. We were driving from Niagara Falls through Canada.
September 19, 1961 has the first really dramatic and well-publicized case of alien abduction.
The more that you learn about it, the more incredible it becomes.
As the story goes, on September 19th, 1961, Betty and Barney Hill were driving home from their honeymoon in Montreal. As they drove through New Hampshire's White Mountains, they said they were followed by what felt like a spotlight.
It's late at night. Betty sees this unusual light that seems to be maneuvering.
This light stopped in midair directly in front of us. The car motor stalled, and at that point, I realized that they undoubtedly planned to take us on board.
And then the next thing is that they're 35 miles down the road and they have no idea how they got that far down the road. It turns out they were missing 2 hours.
My wife decided, well, we should notify someone, and we thought of notifying of the military base located in this area.
A radar had detected something unidentified and had reported it through channels inside the Air Force.
They had tracked an unidentified craft at 2:14 a.m., just about the time we estimate that the UFO left.
This case did get a lot of behind-the-scenes attention from some very interesting scientists. They wanted to know what happened to Betty and Barney Hill.
They developed a series of nightmares, and as a result of that, the ufologists told them you should be regressed hypnotically to try to see if you remember more. And he played the tapes for us. They are terrifying.
Captain, what is he? All right, that's all.
Something very traumatic had happened to them.
We're gathered together tonight to hear an extraordinary story. One of the most fascinating stories in the history of man. Barney and Betty Hill are two of many Americans who claim to have seen an unidentified flying object, and two of perhaps 100 who claim to have been aboard a flying foot.
It's one thing to say that you've seen a UFO. It's quite another to say that you've been on board one.
I think everyone in the country has heard about Betty and Barney Hill.
The Hills encounter becomes the first widely publicized credible report of alien abduction in history.
They've been called the Adam and Eve of alien abductees. They set the standard. Their case is the one that really started it all. The prototype for what has become all too familiar throughout the years for fans of science, science fiction, and otherworldly encounters.
The Hill case has become a classic example of alleged extraterrestrial contact with human beings because it contains elements which are still the subject of heated debate among UFO investigators all over the world.
The Betty and Barney Hill case is like Area 51 in the legend of aliens, as high as that. Once you have smoked the gateway drug of Area 51, this guy's waiting behind the middle school to give you something a little harder that will get you addicted for life.
It's really sort of this historical event in history.
Those images of poking, prodding, gray creatures, Betty and Barney brought them to the forefront.
Do you think that E.T. would look the way that E.T. looks without Betty and Barney Hill?
No.
In New Hampshire, where this took place, there's actually a sign, an official historical sign.
Whether you believe this happened or not, there's no denying that it is part of pop culture. Thus, it is historically significant.
It was just an ordinary day in America. Betty, a social worker, and Barney, a U.S. postal employee, were driving home after their honeymoon in Niagara Falls. A trip they would never forget.
Both were active in the civil rights movement, worked with the NAACP. Their status as an interracial couple, not exactly an easy one in those times. They were well-educated and well-regarded, two affable, intelligent people who just had needed a break. Barney decided a trip through Montreal and Niagara Falls was what the doctor ordered. They didn't have a ton of dough to their name, but they were going to make the best of it. They didn't forget their dog, however, Delcy the Dachshund, who they just adopted 6 weeks prior to go take the vacation as well.
Betty and Barney had a wonderful time in Niagara Falls. They spent the following afternoon in Montreal. They thought about spending the night downtown, but they heard that there was a hurricane whirling up the coast.
September 19, 1961, my husband Barney and I were in Montreal, and we heard a weather report that a hurricane was coming up the coast and probably would hit our hometown of Portsmouth. So we decided to return to Portsmouth, get there before the hurricane.
That journey from Montreal to Portsmouth, New Hampshire should have been around 5 hours. Now on the road home, and unbeknownst to them, this sudden change of plans would change their lives forever.
They were on their honeymoon?
Yeah, they were on their way home from their honeymoon.
Yeah, I had no idea about that part of it.
Yeah, I had no clue.
So we went to restrooms and we stopped in Colorado and then gas for the car.
When we traveling south on Route 3, arrived in an area called Lancaster, New Hampshire, Betty called my attention to an object or a star that she had been watching.
I suddenly saw a new star in the sky. And as I watched it, it became bigger and brighter. So we stopped the car to get out to get a look at this.
Betty had never seen a satellite before, so Betty wondered, could this be a satellite? But then she thought, no, it's not behaving like a satellite.
She then passed the binoculars to me and said, well, you must really look at this satellite because it's not behaving as we would expect.
It's clear at this point this was not a satellite. It does a circle. It seems to fly away to the west and then come back directly towards them.
Barney is coming up with the other explanations. Maybe it's a passenger jet.
At first, Barney suspected the object to be a commercial plane en route to Montreal.
And surprisingly, this began coming in my direction at a very rapid rate of speed. Well, this caused me to become quite alarmed. I felt uncomfortable to see this, so I returned to the car, and so did she, and we drove down the highway.
Privately, he knew that this was unusual, but he said to Betty, don't even think about that, and let's get home.
Up until now, the sighting had been at quite a distance, but now that they've driven down the road several miles, they look up, and it's still there.
As they continue driving south, Betty notices the aircraft appears to be stalking them.
It knows that we're here. They're thinking this has a particular interest in us. There's no other cars on the highway, and this light is getting brighter and it's getting closer.
As they looked at it, it flew in a zigzag pattern, and then it appeared to bounce back and forth in the sky like a ping pong ball. Betty said to Barney, it's coming closer, Barney.
Barney starts to panic.
Well, from this point, I was getting quite frightened. They could obviously see us on the ground with the lights of the car on. I thought they were playing a game with us out there.
It followed us for approximately 30 miles, and then in an area called Indian Head, it left the top of the mountain, came out over the highway, and stopped mid-air on the highway right in front of us.
And it was at this point that the disc-shaped craft started hovering silently.
On each end, two fin-like wings extended each side with a red light creating a W shape with the flatter disc in the center. In the center, a row of windows that he could actually see into lay across the narrow side of the disc. And what he saw was even more bizarre. I'm going to quote Barney for what happened next. Quote, I shook my head and turned away and looked back and said, oh God, it's there. What is this thing?
Barney freaks the fuck out. He jumps back in the car. He's like, Betty, we gotta go. They're gonna get us.
He ran back to the car and went speeding down the highway to avoid capture.
And as he began to take off in the car, the ship once again swooped overhead, this time directly above the vehicle.
Betty rolls down the window and stuck her head out to look at the craft. Betty's not giving up on the craft. She seemed to be more interested in it than Barney is at this point. Barney just seemed scared.
Attempting to lose whatever was with them, Barney then made a random turn off of Route 3 onto a smaller road. Soon, the car began to vibrate with a rhythmic buzzing tone.
She starts hearing this rhythmic sequence of buzzing and beeping sounds. And apparently while they're hearing these beeping noises, Betty and Barney Hill start feeling a strange tingling sensation passing through their bodies.
There's something shifting in the car.
I don't know.
Oh.
How strange.
They start coming back to their senses and start coming back to reality, and they realize that they somehow traveled 35 miles south, and they really had no memory of how they had gotten there or what had just happened in the prior 2 hours.
It was at this moment, beeping, when your memory returned. It's a time previous to this that you can't remember.
Yes, Dr. Simon, that's right.
I see.
In my experience working with these cases is that partly it's the subconscious mind blocking some of these memories and then bubbling up to the surface. And partly it could be the alien beings are programming people not to remember.
When they finally arrived back home, they believed they made it home in time, just after 3 a.m. as expected, but were more than surprised to see the sun begin to rise as they did make it home.
About the clock, you said you glanced up at the clock as you were undressing.
I saw that it was 5 after 5. Didn't register. I don't think Barney realized it either. Neither one of us realized till months later that it was that late.
That was all the Hills could remember about the incident when they finally arrived home, but they both had an uneasy feeling that there was something more.
They each went inside, leaving their personal things on the porch, and took a shower before going to bed, determined to worry about it in the morning after a stressful and scary ride home.
Wasn't that strange, Barney? Whatever it was.
Betty, I don't want to talk to anybody about last night, all right?
All right.
If you want to talk about it, we can just talk about it to ourselves.
The next morning, after they awoke, they realized things were a little off.
Betty and Barney noticed that the clocks on their walls in their home were no longer working, and they noticed that none of their watches were working either.
And that was just really the first of the sort of odd things they started noticing. The next thing Barney noticed was that the strap to his binoculars was torn, and he had no idea how that had happened. He also noticed that a pair of his nicest dress shoes somehow got all scraped up. Betty picks up her clothes that she wore the night before, and as she was putting her dress away in her closet, she noticed that it was torn at the hem, zipper, and lining. And she said there was even a pinkish powder on her dress as well.
She also realized that she was no longer wearing her blue earrings that she was wearing the night before.
So those were missing as well. And to top it all off, when Betty and Barney went back out to their vehicle, they noticed that there was multiple shiny concentric circles on the trunk of their car, which had obviously not been there the prior day.
And there were these strange, shiny spots on the back of the car. I finally got Barney to come out and look at them.
Barney refused to speak about the craft initially, and proposed rather they both go into separate rooms, and each of them draw the craft before they discuss it, as he was convinced that maybe they hallucinated, and if they both drew different things, then this would put his mind at ease.
Is this the drawing that's like popular? The one that's like in every story about them?
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately for him, they were both incredibly similar. It's at this point that Barney actually wanted to drop the entire thing. He wanted to keep the whole thing to themselves and never to speak of it again, worrying it would ruin their reputation. This was the 60s, and again, their relationship had already brought tensions to their lives, and whatever had happened that night before had clearly shaken him. But Betty fully disagreed and felt like she needed to reach out to someone.
So by the afternoon of that day, after they've been making all these discoveries, Betty decides to call her sister Janet.
I was 13 years old, and I had arrived home from school in the afternoon. My mother was on the phone with my Aunt Betty, and I heard my mother's side of the conversation. When my mother hung up the phone, She told me that Betty and Barney had seen a flying saucer up close. I was in shock. I thought this was very, very strange.
It was suggested to Betty and Barney Hill that they call the local Air Force base about their encounter. And here is the official U.S. Air Force report. Their testimony of the sighting is recorded. It's regarded as a strange incident. The subject of the report is unidentified flying object. The report states that radar did indeed pick up an unidentified flying object that night.
The Air Force has confirmed that a UFO was tracked on radar in the vicinity of New Hampshire's White Mountains on the night of the Hill's abduction.
It also states that while there are some inconsistencies in the story, Barney Hill's, quote, honesty and seriousness appear to be valid, but there was no official final conclusion as to what they had seen that night.
Major Henderson's conclusion was revised 3 times after his initial conclusion that they had simply misidentified Jupiter, from an optical illusion to a temperature inversion, with the final conclusion being insufficient data.
About 6 weeks later, Barney and I had gone out in the evening, and when we came home, on the kitchen table was a pile of dried leaves.
Piled onto their kitchen table. What? Naturally, they checked the doors, but they were all locked and unharmed.
And when I went to clean up the pile of dried leaves, there was my blue earrings I was wearing that night.
There's a fucking pile of leaves and an earring, like the aliens came in like, uh-oh, we forgot to return the earring.
That
Quick,
is such a
pile it under the
that is
leaves.
such a
They'll never know.
strange detail.
Months passed, but life was not the same for the Hills. Barney suffered recurring headaches. They were tense, upset, couldn't sleep.
After the alleged abduction, for a time being, Betty and Barney tried to keep it quiet. After a while, they shared their experience with people at church. As much as they tried to keep it quiet, a reporter for the Boston Traveler tracked down the story and published it a few years later. And at that time, they really became internationally known.
A Boston reporter picked up their story, and readers went crazy to learn more.
And it ran for 5 days on the front pages of the Boston newspaper. I went on TV. I was questioned by F. Lee Bailey and had lie detector testing. And I had very, very high ratings for honesty and truthfulness.
Hello, which one have I got on the line? Or have I got your both?
You have us both on.
Oh, how wonderful. Hello, that's you, Barney?
Yes, that's correct.
And Betty, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Now, as I understand it, we have to go back to 1961 to start this whole incident, don't we?
Yes, that's right. September 19th, 1961.
We remember seeing the men in the road, but we couldn't get beyond that. And so we would go back there about once a month, thinking if we could find the spot where we saw the men in the road, we could remember what happened. And we were beginning to get little memories back, but nothing too shocking. And then Barney's health failed.
Barney ended up taking a leave of absence from work. He had developed high blood pressure, bleeding ulcers, post-traumatic stress disorder, wasn't able to sleep. He was very traumatized by all of this.
And he wasn't responding to medication, so his doctor sent him to a psychiatrist. So he referred us to Dr. Betty and Simon in Boston.
Dr. Simon interviewed Betty and Barney separately and together, and then he began 6 months of separate hypnosis sessions.
Dr. Simon uses a then revolutionary technique known as hypnotic regression, a process by which Betty and Barney are put under a trance and then are encouraged to recall memories that are not available to the conscious mind. In sessions lasting over 6 months, Dr. Simon uncovers shocking facts about the first ever modern account of an alien abduction.
And then I pulled over to the side of the road, and I looked toward the sky. It looks like a big pancake. I drive, and Betty is still looking, and she said, Barney, they're still following us. What do they want?
Barney and Betty Hill's hypnosis therapy shows the field of ufology.
Under hypnosis, Barney remembered that the reason why his binocular strap was torn was because when he ran away from the approaching UFO and got back into the car, he had torn it.
Audio recordings of hypnosis sessions reveal the frightening moment when Betty and Barney are taken.
I believe this is a flying saucer. I can see it tilted toward me.
I don't know where we are. I don't even know how we got here.
They took me and carried me up this ramp. God, I'm scared.
They're taking me up to the object. I don't want to go on it. I don't want to. I don't know what's going to happen if I go on it. I don't want to go. I go up the ramp and I go inside.
They're saying to Betty, there's nothing to be afraid of. We only need to do a few simple tests. You won't be harmed. And then you'll very quickly be on your way. She kicks the one who is beside her, and this tears the hem on her dress down. They regain control of her, and she is taken into an examining room on the craft.
That's where Betty meets someone she calls the Examiner.
Betty also displayed a considerable amount of emotional distress during her capture. In fact, it was so bad that Dr. Simon had to end one of the hypnosis sessions early because Betty was screaming in pain.
And he's taking me to my face. And I'm crying and I tell her it's hurting,
Dr. Simon was astounded by Betty's hypnotic recall of the alleged abduction, mainly because Barney told him essentially the same incredible story in a separate hypnotic interview.
One of the men examined his spine with a tool and began counting his vertebrae. Barney also stated that he heard them speaking in a mumbling language that he had trouble understanding. Now what's interesting is that they also were asked to sketch out the beings, and it definitely looks exactly like what we call gray aliens.
The leader, I would say, was my height, a little taller than I am, and I'm 5 foot. They all had dark uniforms. I shouldn't say uniform. All had a one-piece dark clothing on. They were bald, no hair, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, and no ear, we could say. Very large eyes, very small, flat nose, thin slit for mouth.
This was kind of the first time that we'd ever seen quote-unquote gray alien actually looked like. It was all based upon Betty and Barney Hill's recollection of what they looked like.
But after the experiments, or whatever they were, things became surprisingly more congenial between Betty and her captors. He also showed her a map of where they traveled in the galaxy, which Betty recounted.
Among the most intriguing and notable details gleaned from the sessions was Betty's hand-drawn star map. The sessions enabled her to recall the image in such great detail that she was able to draw it on a piece of paper.
There it is.
This is the map you drew.
Yep.
This is amazing, because how much did you know about astronomy?
Not a thing.
The image was shown to numerous astronomers with the hope that one of them would be able to identify the constellation. Unfortunately, no one could.
Astronomers became fascinated, for what if the map corresponded to a pattern of real stars from an alien viewpoint? Astronomers reasoned that the majority of star systems likely to have life-supporting planets were located in the obscure southern constellation of Reticulum. Yet 3 stars in the cluster were unknown until 1969. No astronomer on Earth knew their position in 1963. But that same year, Betty Hill drew a map which contained these undiscovered stars. Astronomers at Ohio State University requested a computer to put them in their correct position out beyond the incredible double star system of Zeta Reticuli 1 and Zeta Reticuli 2, 220 trillion miles, 37 light years away from Earth, looking toward our sun. And the computer duplicated with virtually no variation the now famous map of Betty Hill.
Now, if you know anything about alleged alien species, the grays allegedly come from the star system Zeta Reticuli.
Noted astronomers Carl Sagan and Stephen Soter believed the similarities between Betty's star map and Zeta Reticuli to be nothing more than a random alignment of chance points.
But after all of these hypnotic sessions were over and seemingly all this was behind them, Betty and Barney Hill went back to living their regular lives,
When Barney Hill heard the playback of the tapes, he said, "I felt so overwhelmed and relieved. Parts of my life that were missing have been added to again. Parts of my life were being put back together."
Their story and the information that they recalled in those hypnosis sessions were eventually released in this big long report. And from there, a ton of books were written, endless films and movies and TV shows as a result of this. There was just a ton of media that came out of the Betty and Barney Hill story.
There's a James Earl Jones version of this that exists. Are you serious? I'm telling you, there is. I've seen it.
The UFO incident, 1975.
75? That's
I can click
pre-Vader.
on it.
The Hills' story was eventually made into a 1975 TV movie starring James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons, titled, ironically, The UFO Incident, which Betty Hill and Dr. Simon both did press for upon its release. By that point, Barney had died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1969, at a young age of 46. Betty would go on to become a fixture in the UFO circuit and always enjoyed telling her tale to those who would listen. Those who considered her one of the originators of the alien abduction legend. She passed away in 2004 at the age of 84.
There's a lot of controversy surrounding this event. Regardless of what did or did not happen that night, their story is one that has become a big part of UFO lore.
According to a Gallup poll taken in 1966, only 7% of Americans thought that UFOs had otherworldly origins. This is contrasted with a public opinion laboratory poll taken only 20 years later, where 43% of respondents said that they thought UFOs were vehicles used by extraterrestrial space travelers.
This case, after all, is the ground zero of the alien abduction phenomenon. If you were a skeptic, you would say this is the case that led to lots of copycats. Right. And if you're a believer, you'd say this is the case that encouraged other people to speak out because they felt that maybe they weren't alone with this after all.
Yes. Something clearly happened to them. Where a thing happened, couldn't tell you what it was.
A lot of details. I'm just like, if they made this up, that's a lot of really specific detail.
No, that's the thing, you need these details. They were like, you think they're in the car and they're like, okay, I'm gonna tear the dress. We'll throw a stain on there. I'm gonna go out there and I'm gonna buff the exterior of our car. I'm gonna ruin our car. But who's to say they didn't have that damage from the day before, the day prior? Do you think that in the whole of their trip of Montreal, she's walking around with a ripped, stained dress? What if in Montreal, maybe something else did happen? Maybe they were part of a crime. Maybe they perpetrated something. That was the evidence from the crime that they committed, and they blamed it on aliens.
Why are you so gung-ho on making these people horrible human beings?
It's exciting that way.
And aliens aren't exciting?
I'll even read you a little bit of the analysis done by Matthew Moniz, who is a scientific analysis director, and he analyzed the dress sample from Betty. He said that the dress showed a form of degradation that is consistent with high UV exposure. Now, what's interesting about this pink powder, too, and this has been actually investigated and tested by 5 different laboratories, and they've determined that the actual powder, whatever the substance is not of organic origin. You guys will have to let us know what you think about the Betty and Barney Hill story. Do you believe it or do you not? I don't fucking know. That's my answer. Right? I don't fucking know, and I don't think any of us will ever know whether or not that story is true.
I have no doubt that maybe something bad happened to them, but is that something because of aliens? That's where it gets a little hokey for me.
Oh, I'm really torn. I don't feel that I have enough evidence to say absolutely yes, but I also don't feel like I have enough reason to say absolutely no. I don't know. I don't want to say yes or no, Matt.
Me neither. It's a really tricky, and happens all the time with conspiracy stuff. You get your reasons for, you have your reasons against, and ultimately sometimes it just comes down to what you want to believe.
Who knows?
The only thing, we will never have objective truth about what happened in this scenario. We just can't. It's impossible. The fact that they found their piece is what, obviously
is
the
all
most
that really
important.
matters, yeah.
What do you think? Were the Hills really abducted, or was it all made up?
Whatever the reality is, the abduction of Betty and Barney Hill captured the nation, inspired countless movies and books, both nonfiction and fiction, and for better or for worse had a huge impact on science fiction and UFO research.
May the Hills always be remembered for the courage and bravery they displayed in the face of adversity. Not only were they true pioneers in the civil rights movement, they served an integral role in bringing much-needed legitimacy to the field of UFO research. May their lives forever serve as a reminder to always keep an open heart and an open mind, and may they rest in peace.